For men were laughing at a kitchen table in Fort Wayne, Indiana, when the person they trusted most descended the stairs with a semi-automatic rifle. Joseph Corcoran had just finished an argument with his older brother James about money. Within minutes, James lay bleeding alongside his best friends Timothy Bricker and Doug Stillwell, and his sister's fiancé Robert Turner. When asked if he had anything to say before his execution 27 years later, Corcoran's response was chillingly brief. "Not really. Let's get this over with." His last meal? Ben and Jerry's ice cream. The 22-year-old had gunned down 4 people in the home he shared with his family on July 26, 1997. After the shooting, he calmly walked outside and asked a neighbor to call police. When officers arrived, they found him sitting on the porch, waiting. Corcoran became Indiana's first execution in 15 years, ending a moratorium that stretched through 3 presidential administrations. His case reopened debates about mental illness, family violence, and whether a state should end a life when no clear motive existed for taking 4 others. This wasn't a crime of passion or revenge. There were no drugs, no robbery, no grand conspiracy. Just a young man who heard voices, owned weapons, and made a decision that destroyed 2 families forever. His attorneys argued paranoid schizophrenia drove him to pull that trigger. Prosecutors painted a different picture entirely. What drives someone to annihilate the people closest to them? How does a quiet disagreement transform into Indiana's most notorious quadruple murder? And why did it take nearly 3 decades for justice to reach its conclusion? Joseph Edward Corcoran entered the world on April 18, 1975, in Hamilton, Indiana, the youngest child of Jack and Catherine Corcoran. His parents worked hard to provide for their family of 5 children, Joseph, his older brother James, and 3 sisters. From the outside, the Corcorans appear to be a typical Midwestern family living in the small-town atmosphere of Hamilton, where neighbors knew each other and children played freely in quiet streets. But behind the white picket fence facade, something darker was brewing. Joseph had been on trial in 1992, when he was just 16, for the murder of his parents, though he was found not guilty due to lack of evidence. This shocking detail reveals that long before the quadruple murder that would seal his fate, Joseph Corcoran had already been touched by violence in the most intimate way possible. His childhood minister, Reverend David Leitzel, would later describe Joseph as a troubled young man who struggled with hearing voices and experiencing paranoid episodes. Friends and family members painted a picture of someone who could be charming and personable one moment, then withdrawn and suspicious the next. His sister Kelly Ernst, who would later share a home with him, described a brother who seemed to live in constant fear of imagined threats. The boy who should have been playing baseball and attending school dances was instead grappling with mental health issues that his small-town community barely understood. In the 1990s, discussions about schizophrenia and paranoid delusions were whispered conversations, not open dialogues about treatment and support. Joseph's family watched helplessly as he descended deeper into a world where reality and delusion blurred together. Teachers at Hamilton High School noticed his increasing absences and erratic behavior. Classmates remembered someone who kept to himself, often appearing agitated or distracted. The teenager who once showed promise was slowly being consumed by something his family couldn't name or control. By the time he reached adulthood, Joseph Corcoran had become a young man walking on the edge of a precipice that no one around him fully recognized. After the tumultuous events of his teenage years, Joseph moved to Fort Wayne with his brother James and sister Kelly Ernst. The industrial city, with its population of roughly 250,000, offered the promise of anonymity and a fresh start. Fort Wayne had seen its share of economic challenges as manufacturing jobs disappeared, leaving neighborhoods where opportunity felt scarce and tensions could run high. The Corcoran siblings shared a modest home where they tried to rebuild their lives away from the shadows of their past. James worked steadily and had developed a close circle of friends who would often gather at the house for casual visits. Kelly was planning her wedding, excited about starting a new chapter with her fiancé Robert Turner. For a brief period, it seemed like the family might find some semblance of normalcy. Joseph, however, continued to struggle with the voices that haunted him. Neighbors occasionally heard him talking to himself or pacing restlessly in the yard during late hours. He had difficulty maintaining steady employment, often quitting jobs after just a few weeks, claiming that co-workers were plotting against him or that his supervisors were trying to sabotage his efforts. The stress of living with untreated mental illness while trying to appear functional took its toll. Joseph became increasingly dependent on his siblings for emotional and financial support. When Kelly announced her engagement to Robert Turner, Joseph realized that his living situation was about to change dramatically. The wedding would mean Kelly and Robert would want their own space, and Joseph would need to find somewhere else to live. This looming change created a pressure cooker environment in the household. What should have been a time of celebration for Kelly became a source of mounting anxiety for Joseph. The stability he had found living with his siblings was about to disappear, and he didn't know how to cope with another major life transition. July 26, 1997 started like any other summer Saturday in Fort Wayne. The temperature climbed into the 80s, and families across the city were enjoying weekend barbecues and gatherings. At the Corcoran house, James had invited his longtime friends Timothy Bricker and Doug Stillwell over for what was supposed to be a relaxing evening. Robert Turner, Kelly's fiancé, was also there, probably discussing wedding plans and future living arrangements. The four men settled around the kitchen table, sharing stories and laughter that echoed through the house. Timothy Bricker, 30, worked in construction and was known for his quick wit and generous spirit. Doug Stillwell, 32, was a loyal friend who had known James since childhood. Robert Turner, 30, was looking forward to marrying Kelly and starting a family together. These were ordinary men living ordinary lives, completely unaware that death was preparing to descend from upstairs. Joseph had been lying on his bedroom floor, a position he often assumed when the voices became particularly loud. According to court filings, he heard men's voices downstairs and became increasingly agitated. The sound of laughter and conversation that most people would find comforting became, in Joseph's disturbed mind, evidence of conspiracy or threat against him. What happened next unfolded with terrifying speed. Joseph retrieved a semi-automatic rifle and quietly made his way downstairs. The men at the kitchen table had no warning, no chance to defend themselves or even understand what was happening. In a matter of seconds, Joseph opened fire on the four people who trusted him most in the world. James Corcoran, the older brother who tried to provide stability and support, was struck down first. Timothy Bricker and Doug Stillwell, friends who had welcomed Joseph into their circle countless times before, fell next. Robert Turner, the man about to become Joseph's brother-in-law, was the final victim of this incomprehensible act of violence. The house that had been filled with warmth and camaraderie just moments before was now a scene of unimaginable carnage. For young men who had been planning their futures, discussing their dreams and sharing their friendship, lay dead on the kitchen floor. The silence that followed the gunfire was broken only by Joseph's footsteps as he walked outside to face the consequences of what he had done. What makes this case particularly haunting is the absence of any clear motive that others could understand. There was no argument over money, no dispute about drugs, no history of violence between Joseph and his victims. The closest thing to a trigger was Joseph's anxiety about Kelly's upcoming marriage and his need to find a new living arrangement. But for most people, housing concerns don't lead to mass murder. The randomness and senselessness of the violence is what continues to disturb people who study this case. For lives were ended not because of anything they had done, but because one troubled young man's grip on reality finally snapped completely. The tragedy extends beyond the immediate victims to encompass their families, friends, and a community that struggled to comprehend how such evil could merge for what seemed like an ordinary family dispute. The legal proceedings against Joseph Corcoran moved forward with the methodical pace of the Indiana court system, but the case itself was anything but routine. Prosecutors had overwhelming physical evidence. Joseph had made no attempt to flee or hide his actions. He had calmly walked outside after shooting and waited for police to arrive, making their job of establishing guilt straightforward. The real battle in the courtroom centered around Joseph's mental state and whether he understood the nature and consequences of his actions. Defense attorneys argued that their client suffered from severe paranoid schizophrenia that had rendered him incapable of forming the intent necessary for murder. They presented testimony from mental health experts who described Joseph's long history of hearing voices, paranoid delusions, and increasingly erratic behavior. The prosecution, however, painted a different picture. They argued that while Joseph might have mental health issues, he still understood that killing 4 people was wrong and would result in serious consequences. They pointed to his calm demeanor after the shooting and his apparent understanding of the need to contact police as evidence that he retained enough mental capacity to be held responsible for his actions. The jury faced an agonizing decision. On one hand, they had clear evidence that Joseph Corcoran had killed 4 people in cold blood. On the other hand, they were confronted with compelling testimony about his mental illness and the question of whether someone in the grip of severe psychosis could be fully responsible for their actions. After deliberating, they returned a verdict of guilty on 4 counts of murder. Joseph Corcoran was sentenced to death on August 26, 1999, joining Indiana's death row population at the Indiana State Prison in Michigan City. The case generated relatively little national attention at the time, overshadowed by other high-profile crimes and executions, but it would later become significant as Indiana's death penalty system faced increasing scrutiny over the execution of mentally ill individuals. For 27 years, Joseph Corcoran's case wound its way through the appeals process, creating a paper trail that would eventually span thousands of pages. His attorneys filed motion after motion, arguing that executing someone with severe mental illness violated constitutional protections against punishment and unusual punishment. The appeals process revealed disturbing details about Joseph's mental state that hadn't been fully explored during his original trial. Medical experts documented his ongoing struggles with paranoid schizophrenia, describing episodes where he believed prison guards were poisoning his food or that other inmates were plotting against him. These weren't temporary setbacks, but consistent patterns of behavior that persisted for decades. Defense lawyers also raised questions about the adequacy of Joseph's original legal representation and whether the jury had received sufficient information about the nature and severity of his mental illness. They argued that advances in understanding of schizophrenia since the 1990s showed that Joseph's condition was far more debilitating than anyone had realized at the time of his trial. As his execution date approached in December 2024, advocacy groups and legal organizations joined the effort to save Joseph's life. They filed petitions with Governor Eric Holcomb, arguing that Indiana should not execute someone whose crimes were the direct result of untreated severe mental illness. They pointed to the fact that Indiana hadn't carried out an execution since 2009, suggesting that the state had moved away from capital punishment. The final appeals were denied one by one, with courts ruling that while Joseph's mental illness was tragic, it didn't absolve him of responsibility for taking 4 lives. Governor Holcomb ultimately declined to commute the sentence, stating that justice demanded that Joseph Corcoran pay the ultimate price for his crimes. The legal system that had kept him alive for nearly 3 decades was now prepared to end his life. December 18th, 2024 began like any other day on Indiana's death row, but everyone knew this one would be different. Joseph Corcoran had spent 27 years in a 6 by 10-foot cell, his world reduced to concrete walls, steel bars, and the constant supervision of correctional officers. Now, as midnight approached, his time was finally running out. For his final meal, Joseph requested Ben and Jerry's ice cream, a choice that seemed almost childlike in its simplicity. No elaborate spread of favorite foods, no symbolic final gesture, just ice cream, perhaps a connection to happier memories from a time before voices and paranoia had consumed his life. The request spoke to something innocent that still existed somewhere deep inside the mind of a man who had committed unspeakable acts. In his final hours, Joseph was granted a meeting with his family, including his wife Tahina, whom he had married while incarcerated. These conversations remained private, but one can imagine the weight of words spoken between people who had been separated by prison walls for decades, knowing they would never see each other again. Reverend David Leitzel, the Wesleyan minister who had known Joseph since childhood, was there to provide spiritual comfort in his final moments. The same minister who had watched a troubled teenager grow into a mentally ill adult was now preparing to witness his execution. The circular nature of this relationship, from baptism to last rites, captured profound tragedy of a life that had gone so terribly wrong. At Indiana State Prison in Michigan City, the execution protocol began just after midnight. Joseph was escorted from his death row cell to the execution chamber, where he was secured to the gurney that would serve as his deathbed. Prison officials asked if he had any final words to share with the witnesses who had gathered to observe his death. His response was characteristically brief. "Not really. Let's get this over with." Even in his final moments, Joseph Corcoran remained true to the matter-of-fact demeanor he had displayed since that night in 1997 when he walked outside and waited for police to arrest him. There were no dramatic speeches, no pleas for forgiveness, no final explanations, just a simple acknowledgement that his time had come. The lethal injection process began, and Joseph Corcoran was pronounced dead at 12:44 a.m. Central Standard Time on December 18, 2024. Indiana had carried out its first execution in 15 years, ending a chapter in the state's criminal justice history, while raising new questions about the intersection of mental illness, criminal responsibility, and capital punishment. The witnesses who observed Joseph's final moments described a process that was clinical and quiet, lacking the drama that often accompanies fictional portrayals of executions. A mentally ill man who had taken 4 lives had now lost his own, but the larger questions about justice, mercy, and society's response to severe mental illness remained unresolved. As dawn broke over Indiana on December 18, 2024, Joseph Edward Corcoran was gone. But the impact of his actions continues to ripple through the families he destroyed, the legal system that struggled to respond appropriately to mental illness, and the broader conversation about whether executing the mentally ill serves any meaningful purpose in a civilized society. The case of Joseph Corcoran forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, mental health, and the limits of human understanding. In the end, 5 lives were lost, 4 on that terrible night in 1997, and 1 more in the execution chamber 27 years later. Whether that final death served justice or simply added another tragedy to an already heartbreaking story remains a question each of us must answer for ourselves.